The auction hall was silent. Every eye was fixed on the bay thoroughbred standing in the center of the ring. His coat gleamed under the warm lights, but something about him unsettled the buyers. He was restless, his ears pricked forward, his muscles tense, his dark eyes scanning the room as if searching for a way out. Unlike the perfectly disciplined horses that had been sold that night, this one carried an untamed energy, a wildness that many saw as a flaw. The auctioneer cleared his throat, trying to regain the crowd's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, here stands a horse of impeccable lineage, descended from champions. Who will place the first bid?" His voice echoed through the hall, but no one responded. Among the potential buyers stood William Harrington, a powerful figure in the horse racing world. He watched the horse for a moment before shaking his head and murmuring to his assistant, "Too thin, too weak. This one will never be a winner." His words carried weight, and soon the other investors lost interest. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. Inside the ring, Lucas Bennett, the young handler who had trained the horse, felt his chest tighten. He knew what would happen if no one bid. The horse could be sold for an insulting price to someone who didn't understand his potential, or worse, discarded. Lucas glanced at the animal, seeing something no one else did, a fire in his eyes, an untapped greatness waiting to be unleashed. But how could he make them see it? Then, a voice cut through the tension. $3,000. The auctioneer hesitated. The amount was humiliating for a horse of such pedigree. A murmur spread through the room, disapproving glances cast toward the unknown bidder. William Harrington let out a quiet chuckle, crossing his arms. "Pathetic," he scoffed. "Let them take him. That animal will never be worth anything." The sharp crack of the auctioneer's gavel sealed the horse's fate. But Lucas didn't look away. Deep down he knew, one day that man would beg to have him back. The auction was over. The once lively hall now stood nearly empty, save for a few stable hands leading their newly purchased horses out to waiting trailers. The air smelled of sawdust and sweat, mingled with a distant scent of cigars and expensive cologne left behind by the wealthy buyers who had already departed. William Harrington was among them. Without a second glance at the bay thoroughbred he had dismissed so easily, he exited the building, his mind already focused on bigger investments, stronger, more promising horses that, in his eyes, were actually worth something. Outside, under the dim glow of the stable lights, Lucas Bennett stood next to the horse, running his hand down the sleek coat that had failed to impress the audience inside. The animal flinched slightly, still on edge from the commotion of the auction. His dark eyes darted around, ears flicking back and forth as if he, too, could feel the weight of rejection hanging in the air. He didn't understand what had happened. He didn't know that he had just been deemed unworthy, sold for a price so low it was almost insulting. But Lucas knew, and it burned inside him. "They don't see it, but I do," Lucas murmured, tightening his grip on the lead rope. "You're not just some throwaway." A slow, measured set of footsteps approached, and Lucas turned to see the new owner, Frank Dawson, stepping into the light. He was an older man, his face weathered from years spent in the harsh sun, his hands rough from labor rather than luxury. Unlike the millionaires who had filled the auction house, Frank wasn't in this business for prestige. He owned a small, struggling training facility on the outskirts of town, taking in horses that others had deemed lost causes. "Hell of a bargain I got tonight," Frank said, running his hand along the horse's muscular neck. "But I gotta ask, kid, what do you think? You worked with him more than anyone." Lucas hesitated, his eyes tracing the powerful but untamed frame of the horse beside him. He had seen firsthand what this animal was capable of. He wasn't like the polished, well-mannered thoroughbreds that buyers had been bidding on all night. This one had a fire inside him, a wild, unpredictable force that could either lead to greatness or disaster. It would take time, patience, and an understanding that most trainers didn't have. "He's got something in him," Lucas admitted finally. "But he's not gonna be easy." Frank chuckled, adjusting the worn-out cap on his head. The best ones never are. The two men worked together to load the horse into the trailer, the sound of hooves clattering against metal as he hesitated before stepping inside. Lucas secured the latch, his hands steady but his mind racing. As they pulled away from the auction house, he stole one last glance at the grand building in the rearview mirror. He could still hear William Harrington's voice in his head, filled with arrogance and certainty. "That animal will never be worth anything." Lucas clenched his jaw, his resolve hardening like steel. "We'll see about that." The drive to Dawson Stables was quiet, except for the occasional restless movement of the bay Thoroughbred in the trailer. Lucas kept checking the side mirror, watching as the horse shifted uneasily. He couldn't blame him. Tonight had been overwhelming. Sold for a price that barely reflected his worth, hauled away from everything familiar, and now heading to a place he had never seen before. This was supposed to be his second chance. But would he take it? When they arrived, the stable yard was dimly lit, the night air cool and still. Frank parked the truck near the barn, and Lucas wasted no time jumping out. He placed a firm but gentle hand on the trailer door, pausing for a moment before slowly lowering the ramp. Inside, the horse stood frozen, nostrils flaring, his dark eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. "All right, big guy. Let's get you out of here," Lucas murmured, his voice calm but firm. He gave the lead rope a slight tug, but the horse didn't move. Instead, he tossed his head and stomped a hoof, his muscles tight with hesitation. Frank walked up beside Lucas, watching with crossed arms. "Stubborn one, huh?" Lucas sighed. "Not stubborn. Just scared." He loosened his grip and softened his voice. "I know this is new, but you're safe now. Just trust me." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the horse took a tentative step forward. And another. Lucas stepped back, guiding him carefully until all four hooves touched solid ground. "There you go," Lucas said softly, exhaling in relief. Frank clapped him on the shoulder. "You've got patience, kid. You're gonna need it." They led the horse into the barn, where the scent of fresh hay and aged wood filled the air. The stalls weren't fancy, just sturdy wooden enclosures with brass nameplates. They stopped in front of an empty one, and Frank leaned against the doorframe. "He needs a name," Frank said, watching as the horse curiously sniffed his new surroundings. Lucas didn't hesitate. "Phoenix." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Like the bird that rises from the ashes?" Lucas nodded. "Because that's exactly what he's gonna do." Frank chuckled. "All right, Phoenix it is. Let's see if you can turn this reject into a champion." Lucas watched as Phoenix settled into his new stall, his ears flicking forward in curiosity. He had a long road ahead, training, setbacks, doubt. But as he stood there, he made a silent promise. One day, the world would know Phoenix's name, and William Harrington would regret ever letting him go. Morning came early at Dawson Stables. The sun had barely risen when Lucas stepped into the barn, the scent of fresh hay and damp earth filling the cool air. Horses shifted in their stalls, nickering softly as the farm came to life. But Lucas wasn't focused on them. His eyes went straight to the last stall on the left. Phoenix stood near the back, ears flicking forward when Lucas approached. His coat gleamed in the early light, but his posture was tense, muscles coiled like a spring. He was watching, waiting, still unsure if this new place was his home, or just another stop before being discarded again. Lucas took a slow breath and unlatched the stall door. "Morning, big guy," he said, keeping his voice calm. Phoenix eyed him but didn't move. He was still wary. Lucas knew better than to rush him. Trust wasn't built overnight. Frank leaned against the stall door, sipping his coffee. "Think he's ready to work?" Lucas glanced at him, then back at Phoenix. Only one way to find out. They led Phoenix to the round pen, a large enclosed training area surrounded by a wooden fence. The second they let him loose, he bolted. Dust kicked up beneath his hooves as he tore around the perimeter, muscles rippling with power. This was no broken horse. He was a fighter. Frank let out a low whistle. "Damn, he's fast." Lucas nodded, watching closely. Phoenix's strides were long and effortless, his speed undeniable. But there was no discipline. He was running wild, burning off nervous energy. Lucas stepped into the pen, rope in hand. "All right, let's see what we're working with." Phoenix slowed, eyeing Lucas with suspicion. The game had changed. Now, he wasn't just running for himself, he was being asked to listen. And he didn't like it. Lucas took a step closer, raising the rope slightly. Phoenix pinned his ears and tossed his head, backing away. Defiant. Stubborn. Not afraid to challenge him. Frank chuckled. "You've got your work cut out for you, kid." Lucas smirked, but his eyes stayed locked on Phoenix. "Yeah, but I like a challenge." For the next hour, they worked in silence. Phoenix resisted at first, refusing to follow Lucas's cues, testing him at every turn. But Lucas didn't give in to frustration. He moved with patience, matching Phoenix's energy but never forcing him. He knew this wasn't about control. It was about respect. Finally, after what felt like forever, Phoenix slowed. His breathing was heavy, his muscles slick with sweat. And then, he did something unexpected. He turned toward Lucas and took a step forward. A small gesture, but a significant one. Frank nodded approvingly. "He's starting to trust you." Lucas ran a hand over Phoenix's damp coat, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. This was just the beginning. There would be more battles, more moments of doubt. But standing there, in that quiet moment of understanding, Lucas knew one thing for sure. Phoenix wasn't broken. He never had been. He was just waiting for someone to believe in him. The next few days tested both Phoenix and Lucas. Every morning, before the sun had fully risen, Lucas was in the round pen, working with the bay thoroughbred. And every morning, Phoenix fought him, refusing commands, testing boundaries, pushing back with all the fire that had once made him unwanted. But Lucas never lost his patience. He didn't punish Phoenix for his defiance. He didn't force submission. He gave him time. Frank watched from the fence, arms crossed, amusement flickering in his eyes. "You sure you don't want to work with an easier horse? Might save you some bruises." Lucas smirked, rolling his sore shoulders. "What's the fun in that?" Phoenix snorted, tossing his head as if he agreed. That morning, Lucas decided to push a little further. He stepped into the pen without a lead rope, without pressure, just standing, waiting. Phoenix trotted a few steps, then stopped, ears flicking back. The challenge was unspoken. Who would make the first move? Lucas lowered his gaze, turning slightly away. It was a simple technique, a sign of trust. In the wild, horses didn't follow force. They followed leaders who earned their respect. Seconds passed. Then a minute. Then, Phoenix took a step forward. Lucas stayed still. Another step. Then another. And suddenly, Phoenix was standing right in front of him. Frank sat up straighter. "Well, I'll be damned." Lucas reached out, slow and steady. This time, Phoenix didn't flinch. When Lucas' fingers brushed his forehead, the horse exhaled, a deep, steady breath, releasing something that had been pent up for far too long. Lucas smiled. "There you go, big guy." It wasn't victory. Not yet. There was still so much work ahead, but this was a breakthrough. The first crack in the walls Phoenix had built around himself. And in that moment, Lucas knew something with absolute certainty. Phoenix wasn't just another horse. He was special. And one day, the world would see it too. The morning was cool, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and fresh hay as the sun cast a golden glow over Dawson stables. The farm was quiet, save for the occasional whinny of a horse or the distant sound of birds stirring in the trees. Today was different. After weeks of groundwork, after endless hours of building trust, Lucas was finally going to ride Phoenix for the first time. Inside the round pen, Phoenix stood tall, his bay coat gleaming in the morning light. He watched Lucas with sharp, intelligent eyes, his ears flicking back and forth, sensing that something was about to change. Lucas ran a hand down his neck, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. Frank stood by the fence, coffee cup in hand, his expression skeptical. "You sure he's ready for this?" Lucas tightened the girth on Phoenix's saddle, checking the straps carefully. They had taken this process slow, every step deliberate, ensuring Phoenix never felt trapped, never felt the need to bolt. Now, it was time to see if the trust they had built would hold. "He's ready," Lucas said, more to himself than to Frank. He grabbed the reins and placed a foot in the stirrup. The moment he shifted his weight, Phoenix tensed. His muscles coiled like a compressed spring, nostrils flaring. For a split second, Lucas thought he might rear. Frank straightened, lowering his coffee. "Careful, kid." Lucas kept his movements slow, steady. "It's okay, Phoenix," he murmured. "I'm not here to fight you." Phoenix's ears flicked back, his breath sharp and uneven. But he didn't move away. Lucas swung his leg over and settled gently into the saddle. The moment his weight fully rested on Phoenix's back, the horse froze. A few tense seconds passed. Then, Phoenix took one hesitant step forward. And another. Lucas barely moved, keeping his hands light on the reins. The horse was waiting for a signal that meant control, that meant force. But Lucas gave him none. No pressure, no fear, just trust. Frank let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned. He's letting you do it." Lucas smiled, the tension in his body easing slightly. Phoenix's muscles, once rigid with uncertainty, began to loosen beneath him. They weren't moving fast, just a slow, cautious walk around the pen, but to Lucas, it was everything. Because this wasn't just a ride. It was a turning point. Phoenix had spent his life running, from trainers, from expectations, from rejection. Every instinct told him to resist, to flee, to fight against control. But today, for the first time, he wasn't running. He was listening. He was trusting. Lucas reached down, stroking Phoenix's neck with quiet pride. "Told you we'd get here, big guy." Phoenix let out a deep, steady breath, the kind of exhale that only came when a horse finally let go of fear. And as the first rays of golden sunlight spilled over the farm, Lucas knew this was just the beginning. The morning ride had been a victory, but Lucas knew it was only the first step. Phoenix had let him into his world, had given him a chance, but trust was fragile. One wrong move, and everything they had built could come crashing down. For the next few days, Lucas kept the ride short, letting Phoenix get used to the weight on his back. At first, they stayed in the round pen, working in slow, careful circles. It wasn't about control, it was about partnership. Frank watched from the fence, arms crossed, his sharp eyes studying every move. "He's got the speed, but he's holding back," he muttered. Lucas knew Frank was right. Even at a trot, Phoenix's strides were powerful but cautious, as if he was still waiting for something to go wrong. Still waiting for a reason to run. Lucas loosened his grip on the reins, giving Phoenix more freedom. "You don't have to fight me, boy. Let's just run." Phoenix hesitated, ears flicking back, but then he moved. Lucas barely had time to adjust before Phoenix surged forward, his hooves digging into the dirt, kicking up dust. The sudden burst of speed was exhilarating, his long strides eating up the ground effortlessly. For the first time, Lucas felt it, the raw, untamed power that had been hidden beneath all that hesitation. Frank let out a low whistle. Now that's what I'm talking about. But just as quickly as it had begun, it ended. Phoenix faltered, his steps turning uneven. His muscles tensed, and suddenly, he skidded to a halt, nostrils flaring. Lucas barely managed to stay in the saddle. Frank cursed. Damn. He still doesn't trust it. Lucas exhaled, rubbing Phoenix's neck. It's not just me. He doesn't trust himself. Phoenix had been rejected, labeled weak, dismissed before he ever had a real chance. And now, even with his own strength, he was afraid to believe in it. Lucas dismounted and led Phoenix to the fence, letting him catch his breath. He wasn't angry. He wasn't frustrated. He understood. "We'll get there, big guy," Lucas whispered. "One step at a time." And for the first time, Phoenix lowered his head, resting it against Lucas's shoulder. A small gesture, but to Lucas, it meant everything. Because this wasn't just training anymore. This was trust. The weeks passed, and Phoenix was improving, but something was still missing. He had strength, speed, and intelligence. His movements were smooth, his instincts sharp. But every time Lucas pushed him beyond his comfort zone, every time he asked for just a little more, Phoenix hesitated. He would falter, tense up, and shut down, as if he was afraid of his own power. Lucas knew this wasn't just about training. This was about trust. One crisp morning, as dark clouds gathered on the horizon, Lucas made a decision. He led Phoenix out of the round pen and toward the open training field, their biggest test yet. The enclosed space had been safe, predictable. But out here was freedom. Frank stood by the fence, arms crossed, a deep crease forming on his forehead. "You sure about this?" Lucas tightened the girth on Phoenix's saddle, then met Frank's gaze. If he's ever going to race, he needs to believe he can. Phoenix shifted beneath him as Lucas mounted, his muscles coiling like a spring. He could feel the tension in the horse's body. Phoenix knew this was different. Lucas gave him a moment, stroking his neck in reassurance, then gently pressed his heels into his sides. "Let's go, boy." At first, Phoenix responded well. His trot was smooth, his canter controlled. The open field stretched before them, endless and inviting. This was what Phoenix was born for. But then, Lucas urged him for more. Phoenix's ears flicked back. His strides grew uneven. His breathing hitched. The moment Lucas pushed him toward a full gallop, something inside the horse snapped. Phoenix bolted. Lucas barely had time to react before the horse surged forward, his body stiff with panic. He wasn't running with confidence. He was running in fear. His muscles locked, his movements erratic. He wasn't sprinting toward something. He was trying to escape. "Phoenix! Easy!" Lucas pulled gently on the reins, but Phoenix wasn't listening. His instincts had taken over, and now he was lost in his own fear. The fence was coming up, too fast. If Phoenix didn't stop, they would crash. Lucas had a split second to decide. He let go. Not of the reins, but of control. He loosened his grip, eased his posture, and whispered instead of pulling. "You're not trapped anymore. You don't have to run." Phoenix's ears twitched. His frantic stride faltered. For a brief moment, he hesitated. Then, slowly, he stopped. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't clean. His legs trembled, his chest heaved, but he had made the choice. Lucas ran a hand down Phoenix's damp neck, feeling the rapid heartbeat beneath his fingertips. "That's it, buddy. You did it." Frank let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "Damn, kid. You really trust that horse." Lucas smiled, still catching his own breath. "Yeah. And one day, he's gonna trust himself, too." Phoenix exhaled deeply, shaking out his mane. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to believe it. The storm rolled in that night. Rain pounded against the stable roof, the wind howling through the trees like a restless spirit. Inside, Phoenix stood in his stall, his ears flicking with every distant rumble of thunder. Something had changed in him. Lucas could feel it. For weeks, Phoenix had been holding back, caught between instinct and fear. But today, when he had the chance to run blindly, he chose to stop. He had listened. He had trusted. And that meant he was ready for the next step. At dawn, Lucas walked into the barn, his boots sinking slightly in the damp earth. Phoenix watched him approach, his deep brown eyes sharp and alert. The hesitation that had once been there was gone. Frank leaned against the stall door, sipping his coffee. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Lucas nodded. "It's time. The first real test." The racetrack at Dawson Stables wasn't much, just a long, oval dirt track lined with an old wooden fence. But it was enough. If Phoenix could handle a real sprint here, then Lucas knew he was ready to take the next step, a real race. Lucas saddled Phoenix carefully, checking every strap twice. He wasn't nervous, he was focused. Phoenix stood perfectly still, muscles coiled but not tense. He knew what was coming. As Lucas mounted, Frank waved from the fence. "No pressure, kid. But if he's still afraid, you'll know real quick." Lucas smirked. "Yeah, I figured that part out." He gave Phoenix a moment, letting him adjust. Then, with a light squeeze of his legs, he urged him forward. At first, they eased into it. A slow trot, then a steady canter. And then, Lucas leaned in and whispered, "Show me what you can do." Phoenix's ears flicked back. For a heartbeat, Lucas felt that hesitation creep in again. But then, something clicked. Phoenix pushed forward, and this time, he didn't stop. The moment his hooves dug into the dirt, it was like watching pure power unleashed. His strides lengthened, his body moving with effortless grace. The wind whipped past them as they raced down the stretch. Lucas barely had to guide him. Phoenix knew exactly what to do. Frank stood at the fence, watching with wide eyes. Holy hell! For the first time, Phoenix wasn't running in fear. He was running because he wanted to. The final turn came fast. Lucas braced himself, wondering if Phoenix would falter like before. But he didn't. He powered through the turn, smooth and controlled, digging deep instead of pulling back. He had finally let go. By the time they crossed the finish line, Lucas was breathless, not from exhaustion, but from sheer exhilaration. He pulled Phoenix up slowly, letting him ease to a stop. The horse's chest heaved, but his eyes were bright, his ears forward. He knew. Frank strode over, shaking his head in disbelief. That wasn't just fast, kid. That was race-winning fast. Lucas grinned, leaning forward to stroke Phoenix's neck. Told you he was special. Phoenix let out a sharp snort, shaking his mane as if he agreed. But as the dust settled around them, Lucas knew this was only the beginning. The real challenge was still ahead. Because now, they weren't just training. Now, they were ready to win. The energy at the racetrack was electric. The stands were packed, the roar of the crowd blending with the restless stomping of hooves against the dirt. This was the moment Phoenix had been waiting for. Lucas sat tall in the saddle, his fingers gripping the reins, feeling the steady rise and fall of Phoenix's breath beneath him. The other horses pawed at the ground, their riders murmuring last-second commands. But Lucas wasn't focused on them. This wasn't about beating them. This was about proving Phoenix belonged here. Across the starting gate, William Harrington's stallion, ironclad, shifted restlessly. The same horse Harrington had deemed superior. The same man who had once dismissed Phoenix without a second thought. Now they would face off. The announcer's voice boomed over the loudspeakers. And they're off. The gates burst open. Phoenix exploded forward. Hooves pounded, dirt flew, and the world became a blur of motion. Lucas leaned forward, his heart hammering in his chest. This wasn't just speed, this was power. The first turn approached. Phoenix held his ground, his stride stretching longer, smoother. The other riders urged their horses forward, but Lucas barely had to guide him. Phoenix knew exactly what to do. Halfway through the race, Ironclad surged ahead. Harrington's voice echoed in Lucas's memory, "That horse will never be a champion." Lucas whispered, "Prove him wrong, buddy." Phoenix flicked his ears back, then pushed forward. He powered through the final stretch, his hooves barely touching the ground. The hesitation, the fear, it was gone. The finish line was approaching fast. Neck and neck. Lucas gave Phoenix the last bit of freedom he needed. One final push. One final moment to change everything. And then they crossed. First, aftermath. Lucas swung off the saddle, his legs shaky. Phoenix stood tall, victorious. His chest heaved, but his eyes were alive. He knew what he had just done. Frank clapped Lucas on the shoulder, grinning. That wasn't just a win, kid. That was history. Then, through the crowd, William Harrington appeared. His face was tight, unreadable. "Name your price." Lucas didn't hesitate. He ran a hand down Phoenix's sleek, sweat-darkened coat. "He's not for sale." Phoenix snorted, tossing his head, as if he understood. The horse nobody wanted had just become a legend. And this was only the beginning.